Alright, hi everyone, thanks for tuning in today. I'm doing a bit of a different video today, something that I haven't really sort of done too much on before. Been spending a fair bit of time researching into this, but today I'm going to compare the great centres to ever play in the NBA. I know some people think I may be a little bit biased when it comes to this. I'm clearly an Olajuwon fan. But I'm going to try and remain as unbiased as I can to try and give you a different take on this subject that maybe some of you haven't seen or heard before. If you like the content, please remember to like and subscribe. I plan to do more content like this in the future. I might do some different positions or comparing some different players or something along those lines. First of all, I'm going to take you through the stats of the players. And we're going to look at a lot of different information, different ways of looking at these stats, different point of views to go along with them. Trying to put all these players on an even playing field as best we can. I know comparing across eras can be really hard and almost impossible, but we'll do our best to try and give you an unbiased view as how we're going to do it. The centres I've chosen to have a look at in this video, probably the 7 guys that most people would normally talk about: Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, Kareem, Moses Malone, Hakeem, David Robinson and Shaquille O'Neal. From most lists that I've seen and my personal view, these are probably the top 7 centres to have ever played. I know other people might add different names to this list. Some people might add a Patrick Ewing. There's plenty of guys that played way back like George Mikan and that you might add. There's not enough information on these guys to really sort of give good statistics or good idea of what we're sort of looking at. So for now, these are the guys I'm going to work with. So let's kick off. We'll start having a look at some career stats of some of these guys. So we'll start with Bill Russell, the oldest guy of the bunch. Some notable stats when we're looking at his all-time stats is that he was a 5-time MVP, an 11-time champion, and a 12-time All-Star. He also played some of the fewest amount of games of guys on this list. He averaged 22.5 rebounds, 4.3 assists, and 15.4 points. Now, take into account for him and Wilt Chamberlain, there's no statistics kept on blocks and steals. So it might give you a slight different view on these guys to the other ones. So we'll move on to the next person. Next, we're looking at Wilt. Wilt also played a similar amount of games, about 100 more, but 1,045, 4-time MVP, 2-time champion, 13-time All-Star. Pretty impressive. Not as many championships, but Bill Russell was winning them all during this era. Similar amount of rebounds at 22.9, similar amount of assists at 4.4, and a lot more points, basically double the amount of points at 30.1. Second highest amount of points per game per player. Next on to Kareem. Kareem's a 6-time MVP, 6-time champion, 15-time All-Star, 11-time All-Defensive, 19-time All-Star and 2-time Finals MVP. He also had the longest career out of anyone on this list. So longevity is definitely something that comes into play when you start talking about Kareem. 1,560 games, 11.2 rebounds, 3.6 assists, about 1 steal, 2.5 blocks, and 24.6 points per game. Now you've got to take into account Kareem played until he was, I think it was 42 years old. So his points per game did drop towards the end of his career, but we'll talk about that a bit later as well. Next, on to Moses Malone. The one guy that a lot of people probably wouldn't put in this category, but this guy is seriously disrespected. He's a 3-time MVP. He only won 1 championship, but he did play in an era involving most of the guys on this list. So, I mean, he did have a pretty hard time trying to win championships when he was coming up against great teams like the Celtics and the Lakers, and even late in his career, the Bulls. 8-time All-NBA, 2-time All-Defensive, 13-time All-Star, and 1 Finals MVP. Very similar amount of games to Kareem, 1,455, 12.3 rebounds, 1.3 assists, roughly about a steal, and roughly about a block and a half, 20.3 points. Now, one thing to note with his points per game, at the end of his career, he really did bounce around teams as very much a role player and not playing very many minutes. His points per game really did drop off in that time. He was much better than that sort of shows. Next is Hakeem, a 1-time MVP, 2-time champion, 12-time All-NBA, 9-time All-Defense, 12-time All-Star, 2-time Finals MVP. Something I left off there actually is two-time Defensive Player of the Year as well. 1,238 games, 11.1 rebounds, 2.5 assists, 1.7 steals, 3.1 blocks, 21.8 points. Pretty good career. Out of all the guys on the list, he had the most Defensive Players of the Year, which I didn't put on. Next on to David Robinson, a one-time MVP, two-time champion, 10-time All-Star, 10-time All-NBA, 8-time All-Defense, 10-time All-Star, no Finals MVPs, and he also had one Defensive Player of the Year from memory as well. He got no Finals MVPs because in his 2 championships, clearly the best player on his team was Tim Duncan, as Robinson was right at the end of his career. 987 games, 10.6 points, 2.5 assists, 1.4 steals, 3 blocks, and 21.1 points. One thing to note, his short career was basically caused, he started really, really late. As being at the Naval Academy, he had to finish what he was doing there. So he was a very late starter into the game. And lastly, on to Shaq. Shaq was a one-time MVP, 4-time champion, 14-time All-NBA, 3-time All-Defensive, 15-time All-Star, 3-time Finals MVP, 1,207 games, 10.9 rebounds, 2.5 assists, half a steal, 2.3 blocks, and 23.7 points a game. So all these guys all had fantastic careers, fantastic statistics. If you want to just base off this, you can form your opinions from here. But there's a lot more we're going to go into than this. Now, having seen all of this, you may have your own opinions about who you think is the best or the greatest. The next lot of information I'm going to give you might sort of change your mind on this. We're going to be looking at their stats per 36 minutes. So we'll start off with their full-time stats, and I've actually highlighted a few things here. To start off, Wilt and Bill Russell played significantly more minutes per game than any other player. That was the era that they played in. Guys were expected to play significantly more minutes than anybody else. The next one we look at per 36 minutes will even this out a little bit. The next one, I really did note there was a big difference between some of these guys, and that was in field goal percentage. Now, Bill Russell was 0.44 field goal percentage, or 440. Really, really low, well below 50%. For a guy that shot almost all of his shots from within sort of about 7 or 8 feet, that's not exactly a great statistic. And Moses Malone, his was also below 500, just a tick at 495. That's acceptable. Again, he played a very long career, retiring at 39 years of age. Most of these guys did retire between about 38 and 40. The outliers there is Russell retired at 34, Wilt at 36, and Kareem went all the way on to 42, which makes some of his stats a little bit more impressive, if you ask me. Next one was free throw percentage. There was 3 guys I highlighted here, all with pretty woeful free throw percentages. Some of them were being forced to shoot far more free throws than any of the other guys on this list. Like you look at Wilt and Shaq, both shooting more free throws than anyone on the list, and shooting at 5'11 and 5'27. The other guy that nobody ever mentions being a terrible free throw shooter was Bill Russell. He only shot 561. That's pretty poor. And these are guys, Bill Russell often gets his name thrown in a GOAT conversation because of the amount of rings. I'm sorry, but those sorts of free throw percentages makes it pretty hard to play you down the stretch of a game. The next one I want to highlight is the Moses Malone one, which is offensive rebounds. He's a long way ahead of anyone else on this list, averaging 5.1 offensive rebounds a game. Now, Wilt and Russell might be in this category, but offensive rebounds weren't recorded. They were just recorded as rebounds in their era. But from the guys that played when they were recorded, he's by far and wide the best offensive rebounder of the bunch. I'm not going to touch on rebounding. I'll touch on why I won't do that in a little bit further on. And again, next one is assists. Bill Russell and Wilt miles ahead of everyone on assists. I think that largely comes down to the fact they played a lot more minutes than everybody else. Steals, the clear 2 leaders in this category are David Robinson and Hakeem. Hakeem, I'm not sure if he's still top 10, but he was very close to. He was when he retired. And David Robinson at 1.4 is also more than acceptable and much, much higher than anybody else on this list. Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain were apparently renowned for this as well, but again, there was no statistics kept for these guys. Same with blocks. There's two guys to note here. I didn't highlight David Robinson, but Robinson and Hakeem were both over 3 blocks a game, which is pretty impressive. I think both of them had seasons where they averaged over 4, which is really, really impressive. And lastly, we'll look at the points. I've highlighted 2 for very different reasons here. Now, Bill Russell, 15.1 points. It's well below what everyone else is doing. We all know that he wasn't a massive scorer. But 15.1 points at well under 50%. He's taking a lot of shots to get that. Most of the guys that were taking similar amount of shots as him were averaging 5+ more points than him. So that's pretty alarming. And Wilt Chamberlain, he was averaging 30.1 points, but he was attempting far more shots than anybody else. So that also, you've got to take that into account. Teams were relying heavily on his offense. I'm not going to hold it against him, but it's always something that's worth looking at. So next we're going to look at pace of play. And the reason we're going to look at the pace of play is because this is the reason why some of the statistics for Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain are massively enhanced on everybody else. So if we look at the era where they're playing between 60 and 70, we've got the highest pace of play in NBA history. This means they're taking more possessions per game, or having more possessions per game than any other team in history. So that means they've got an opportunity to get more rebounds, more assists, more shots up, all that sort of stuff than anybody else. You compare it to the era where most of the rest of the guys played. Kareem and Moses were a bit through here, and most of the guys were through this sort of era. The pace of play, you're looking at being roughly about 20 possessions on average per team, per game less than what they were having back then. So that's a lot more opportunity for a lot more rebounds, a lot more points, everything. So I just wanted to point that out. It's always being pointed out when you sort of talk about these guys. The stats are very impressive, and it's great to see, but the amount of minutes they were playing and the extra possessions has a lot to do with that. So we always have to take that into account. On to the stats per 36 minutes. Now this really does even it up for a lot of people. It really does bring up, if you look at this, it starts evening up the amount of field goals attempted per game. It brings a lot into play. The assists start evening out for a lot of guys. The points per game, this is where a lot of them end up very similar to each other. You look at Wilt, who averaged 30 points a game. He's now down to 23.6 points a game. Kareem, still up over 24 points a game. Shaq, still up over 24 points a game. Really impressive. Most of the rest of the guys in the around about the 21 to 22 mark. Again, Bill Russell, well below everybody else. But he was taking fewer shots, so that is understandable, but it doesn't increase his field goal percentage. So if you're looking on pure scoring, you can see the best scorers there were Shaq, Kareem and Wilt by far. It's very hard to sort of compare Wilt with the other guys when it comes to defense. But if you look at some of these other guys when it gets to defense, averaging more blocks and more steals. So possibly better defenders, but still really good scorers. So that's one thing you've got to take into account when you're looking at these guys, is the defensive impact that they had as well as their scoring punch. The next one I want to point out is the assists. Not a massive change. You're looking about 1 more assist for the top 3 guys here. So they're averaging 1 more assist a game, creating another 2 to 3 points a game on top of any other player. It's very impressive to see, but there's not a huge difference. Again, the big standout here on offensive rebounds is still Moses. A good, pretty much 2 rebounds ahead of anyone else on the list. Free throw percentage, there's no change in how bad these guys were. And still attempting more free throws than anybody else on the list. So, I mean, we all know Shaq got hacked pretty badly. I think they were pretty much doing the same to Wilt through his era. But this is definitely one I want to sort of touch on when we get to this point. Steals and blocks are really hard to sort of talk about because we're missing 2 of the key guys. And apparently, from everything you hear and everything, the little amount of footage we've seen, Wilt and Bill Russell were both great defenders. Both had great amount of blocks and great amount of steals. So I'm not going to discredit them from that category. We just don't have stats on that. But if we can, a little bit of Kareem's career also missed this, but there was a fair chunk of Kareem's career that this was recorded. I'd probably give Cream a boost up to somewhere around about 3 if all his stats were kept, which would put him up in the category of these guys. They also weren't giving Defensive Player of the Year and all that sort of stuff. But we'll touch on all that stuff as we move on a little bit further as well. So I'm sure by the time we get to this point, you guys are probably forming your own point of views. You might have a different point of view to what you originally had, having a look at the per 36 stats, where it evens it up to how guys sort of regularly play these days as compared to how they did play back in the past, playing almost every minute of the game. But now we're going to move into some other things where we're going to look at Defensive Player of the Years and some other things like that. So I'll explain what all this stuff up the top means, but basically this is talking about the Hall of Fame teammates that these guys had. It's talking about the Hall of Fame teammates they had in championship seasons. And then lastly, we're looking at the All-Star teammates that these guys had in championship seasons. So this is basically talking about the amount of help that these guys had. Controversial way to have a look at it, but it is an interesting point of view, because if we were putting all these guys on the same team on an even playing field playing against the same competition, it would be very interesting to see how all of these guys performed. We've seen in statistic-wise that most of them are all pretty close to each other. But definitely the cattle that you play with has a huge say in what you do. I mean, for instance, Kareem's the guy everyone talks about. You put a lot of these other guys on a team with James Worthy, Magic Johnson, Michael Cooper, all the other great Lakers that played in that era. Would they have won just as many championships? Would they have not? It's very tough to say, but some of these guys have very little help, and I think that's very important to point out, and that's partly the reason why maybe they didn't win as many championships, also partly the reason why they didn't win as many MVPs. When you've got great players that are feeding you the ball, helping you out, doing all those sorts of things, it really does help you. So let's have a look at these guys. We'll start with Hall of Fame teammates that these guys had throughout their careers. Now, Wilt Chamberlain had 7, Kareem had 8, Bill Russell had 16. Now, Bill Russell did play in an era where there was fewer teams, but the Celtics were absolutely packed with Hall of Famers throughout his entire career. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because some of these guys are in the Hall of Fame now and some aren't. Shaq's got 9 and potentially 4 more that will be entering the Hall of Fame in the future. Hakeem played with 4 Hall of Famers and potentially 1 more that might make the Hall of Fame. Moses played with 9 Hall of Famers. He did play with a lot of those Hall of Famers at the end of his career, when he was playing on very few minutes and having very little impact on games. David Robinson played with 6 and 2 more that could potentially enter the Hall of Fame. The 2 more that could potentially enter the Hall of Fame, he played very little basketball with. The help that they had in championship seasons is a great way to look at it as well. Now, Wilt Chamberlain, in his 2 championships, played with 6 Hall of Famers. So if you average that out, he's playing basically on a team where the starting 5 has him and 3 other Hall of Famers. It's a fair bit of help he's getting when he wins his championships. Kareem, 6 championships, 7 Hall of Famers he played with, but he played in a lot of those championships with multiple Hall of Famers as well. Bill Russell won 11 rings with 16 Hall of Famers, and those were just scattered throughout his entire career. Shaq played with 4 Hall of Famers in his championship seasons. Some of them weren't quite up to their Hall of Fame standard when he played with them. Some of them, Shaq wasn't at his Hall of Fame standard when he played with them. So it's an interesting point of view to take. Hakeem played with 1 Hall of Famer, being Clyde Drexler. Clyde Drexler was towards the back end of his career, but he still averaged about 20 points a game that season, so he was still a pretty good player. Moses Malone played with 2 in the championship he played. That would have been, I'm guessing it would be Maurice Cheeks and Dr. J, and they were both still pretty good players at that point in time. And David Robinson played with 3 other Hall of Famers in his championships. The most noticeable would have been Tim Duncan. And then the All-Stars, I'm not going to go too heavily into this, but let's look at the All-Stars they played with in their championship seasons. Wilt, 2 championships, 4 All-Stars. These they were All-Stars in the season that the championship was won. So he played with 4. Kareem played with 9. Bill Russell, again, a huge number at 23. Shaq, the same number as his Hall of Famers. Kareem, his 2 championships, no All-Stars. David Robinson, 2, and that's still pretty impressive. And Moses Malone, 3, but take into account that Moses Malone only won 1 championship. So that year, they almost had an All-Star starting 5. So take out of this what you want. It's a controversial way to have a look at it, but I love to point out these sorts of things. I'm not trying to give anyone else big ups or put anyone down from this, but it might just give you a slightly different take. These are the Hall of Famers that the guys played with. So I've taken All-Stars that they played with as well. Some of these guys, I've highlighted some of them. So we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into how good some of these Hall of Famers were. Some of them are Hall of Famers due to their coaching, like Pat Riley. Others they didn't play with very much, like Adrian Dantley only played one or 2 seasons with Kareem, Pat Riley being a coach. The guys I've highlighted were significant players when these guys were playing. So guys like Guy Rogers and Paul Arizin, they were significant contributors when Wilt Chamberlain played with them. Most of the guys I've highlighted were either 20-point-a-game players or 10-assist-a-game players. So they were having significant impacts on these guys' careers. Take a guy like Kareem, for instance. When Kareem won championships, he only won championships with a point guard either being Magic Johnson or Oscar Robertson. Both guys that are ranked real high all time. That's giving a centre like Kareem basically handing him the ball on a plate every time that he wanted it. Fair enough, he's still got to do what he needs to do, but that's giving him a lot of assistance in doing what he needs to do. Supply around him, guys like Jamal Wilkes, James Worthy, Gail Goodrich, all these guys are 20-point-a-game or around about 20-point-a-game scorers. That takes a lot of pressure off the superstar. Gail Goodrich also played some time with Wilt. Some of these guys, this is in chronological order, so this is the time in which these guys played with these guys. Like if you look at Shaq, he didn't really play much with Steve Nash, LeBron James, Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, Rajon Rondo, but he did play with these guys, and they were significant players during that period. The highlighted players are guys that I'm expecting to make the Hall of Fame in the future that haven't already. But you look at the guys that Shaq did play with in his major part of his career. Kobe Bryant didn't play much with Dennis Rodman, didn't play much with any of these guys, but the championship that he won with in Miami, he had Mourning and D Wade, who were both fairly significant players still around about that time. Bill Russell, I mean, we're speaking from his era, who's who of basketball during that period. All the guys I've highlighted here were 20 plus point a game scorers. Bob Cousy, 10 assists a game. Sam Jones, very similar. Some of these other guys, all pretty significant contributors. A guy like Moses Malone, he did get around a bit in terms of his playing and didn't play a lot of time with some of these guys. Like once you get down sort of below Charles Barkley and Bobby Jones, he didn't play a lot of time with these guys. I mean, you can see David Robinson, another guy on this list. Moses Malone was right at the end of his career when he was playing with him. So I have to put it here to be fair, but you have to take things into account. This mid part of his career are the main guys that he played with. And playing with noticeable guys like Bob McAdoo, Calvin Murphy, doesn't get his dues, great player. Maurice Cheeks, Dr. J and Charles Barkley for a few years. Robinson had some Hall of Fame help. Again, you see Moses in there. Some of these guys not playing a lot of time with, but when he won his championships, he had guys like your Tim Duncan, Tony Parker. I think Ginobili came in right at the end, so he didn't give him too much help. But the interesting stat we did look at before on a previous page, which I might just go back to, and if we're looking at things like finals MVPs and stuff like that, that's a really good statistic to sort of look at when you're talking about some of these guys, because that really shows what they did when they won their championships. And if you look at most of these guys, being Shaq, 3 finals MVPs, 4 championships, playing a huge part in those championships. David Robinson, he was older at the time, he was still contributing a lot, but he wasn't the best player on his team when he won his championships. But he was still a significant contributor. You go back to Hakeem. Hakeem was clearly the best player on his team. As we've seen, as we've gone through, he didn't have a lot of all-stars around him, a lot of help. He did have a good supporting cast, but he really was the main guy carrying that team. Moses Malone, when he won his championship, he won a finals MVP. He played with other Hall of Famers and all-stars, but he was still the best player on his team during that championship. Kareem, enough said about him. I mean, he only got 2 finals MVPs, but by all reports, he should have won at least one more, the one where Magic won Game 7 for them. But everyone said that Kareem was the most influential in that, all over that whole series. Wilt, they didn't give out finals MVP, and the same with Bill Russell, so it's very hard to judge what they would have got. Let's flick back through to where we were. So, just to give you a final look at this and see where guys are at. Now, as I said, I'd love to put up a hypothetical situation of where you put all of these guys an opportunity to play with James Worthy, Magic Johnson. You can put the other guys on here that aren't on this list from that great Lakers team, like your Michael Coopers and all those players. And you put all these guys the opportunity to play on that team, I reckon they're all going to win a very similar amount of championships. They all hold very similar skill sets. People forget how good that Moses is. They really do. He would have been just as successful on that team. I don't think you can split these guys up too much. But I'm sure you guys are all waiting for me to come to some sort of a conclusion by the end of this video and leave you with some sort of list. I'm just not going to do it. I don't think it's fair to put these guys on a list in any particular order. You guys can do that for yourself. Your lists are all going to be very subjective as to who you like and who you don't like. Some guys love the guys on this list, some guys don't. So I'm not going to put anyone up or take anyone down. I just wanted to present the facts and give you an idea of where these guys sat. Statistical speaking wise, if we go right back to that statistic page, and compare them on a pretty even playing field at what they did per 36 minutes. You could throw a blanket over most of these guys and you're only splitting hairs with those highlighted stats. I mean, we all know that Bill Russell wasn't a scorer, as I said before, but from all reports, his impact on the defensive end was bigger than he could ever offer as a scorer. So taking him down because he wasn't a scorer probably isn't fair. People would say that Wilt's the best scorer on this list. I mean, you compare him and Kareem, same amount of shots, basically the same amount of field goals made, really similar amount of points. Not a lot between them. If you were splitting hairs, you could say that Kareem's a much better free throw shooter, but then Wilt's a much better rebounder. You could say that you could compare Kareem and Hakeem and say that Kareem had all the help in the world throughout his career. Hakeem had very little help. Is that a fair comparison? Who knows? But you guys form your own lists. I'd love to see you guys put your comments down in the comments. Give me your own lists, what you guys think. Your point of views are great to see. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, please feel free to leave me a like, subscribe. Thanks for listening, and I hope to bring you some more content like this in the future. Thanks.